We've got a lot of people here, and I, if you are ready, I will introduce the event.
I'm
Well,
ready.
hi, y'all. Welcome to Iran 1400 Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Ervand Abrahamian's thought-provoking new book, Oil Crisis in Iran: From Nationalism to Coup D'Etat. First, I would like to take a minute to explain the Iran 1400 project for those who may not be familiar with it. The goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage healthy and productive conversations about Iran rather than shouting and posturing. The project hopes to make a constructive contribution to understanding Iran and aspires to better interpret Iran's past and present in order to more accurately perceive what Iranians consider a viable future for their country. If you are interested in learning more about the Iran 1400 project, please go to our website, iran1400.org. We have content there in English and Farsi, and we post articles, videos, podcasts, and events like the one we're at today. And we talk about institutions such as modernity, identity, education, fine arts, the women's movement, and so much more. If you scroll to the bottom of our page, you can find a sign up where you can put your email down to be alerted for our newsletter, and that will let you know our upcoming content and events. And you can also find us on social media at Iran 1400 Project. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and you can also find our YouTube at Iran 1400 Project as well. And we also have a podcast, and you can listen to the first English episode on Spotify. It is entitled The Fickle History of the Women's Movement in Iran. And you can also listen to that Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor. And also, if you find today's event interesting, we have some content that's related to the topic that we'll be discussing today. So I encourage you to check out that content. We have an upcoming article in English by Ali Sajjadi entitled U.S. Efforts to Consolidate Iran's Independence and Territorial Integrity During World War II. The Farsi version of the article is already on our website, and we also have a Farsi interview on our YouTube page. We have another article entitled The Quest for Power and Respect, a survey of Iranian foreign policy since 1921. And we have two previous spotlighting and author events that also touched on US-Iran relations. One was with John Qazvinian about his book, America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the Present. And then the second we had was with Kyle Olson, who presented a chapter from the book, American-Iranian Dialogues from Constitution to White Revolution, circa the 1890s to the 1960s. His chapter was titled U.S.-Iran Relations Through the Lens of Heritage Diplomacy, the Case of the Iranian Antiquities Bill of 1930. And these spotlighting and author events are available on our YouTube page. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's guest, Aravand Abrahamian. He is widely regarded as one of the leading historians of modern Iran. He is currently Professor Emeritus of History at Baruch College and the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. He was previously Distinguished Professor of History at the City University of New York and has also taught at the universities of Oxford, Columbia, and Princeton. He is the author of many books, including Iran Between Two Revolutions, The Iranian Mujahideen, Khomeinism, Tortured Confessions, Prisons and Public Recantations in Iran, A History of Modern Iran, and The Coup, 1953, The CIA, and Roots of Modern US-Iranian Relations. His books have been translated and published in Persian, Turkish, Arabic, Italian, and Polish, and he is now working on a book about the 1979 revolution. Also, in 2011, he was elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And so before we begin today's event, I would like to explain the format. So for about 30 minutes, we will listen to Abrahamian discuss his new book, and this will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have a question you'd like to ask, you can send it in at any time during the event, and you can send that question in at the comment section, or you can email your question to media@iran1400.org. Lastly, if you enjoy today's event, please do check out Ervand Abrahamian's book. It is now going to be available. You can order the hard copy. You also, like me, can read it online, which I did before his hard copy was released. And the book is entitled, again, Oil Crisis in Iran, From Nationalism to Coup d'Etat. You can get that on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and a variety of book sources. And so before we begin, we'd like to just play a quick teaser for y'all, and then we'll hear from Ervand Abrahamian himself. Feel free to begin when ready.
Okay, thank you, Sydney, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for Iran 1400 for organizing this book conversation. As you probably know, that there is something called the 30-year rule, under which the US government, especially the State Department, is permitted to declassify and publish documents about US relations to any particular country. So the normal thing is the State Department every year publishes a volume called FRUS, Foreign Relations of the United States, on a particular country. Now, for Iran, for the Mossadeq period, 30 years meant that by 1983, there should have been a volume about what US policy was about in Iran. Nothing came out till 89. And when the volume came out, it was so skimpy. Of course, it had nothing on the coup, but on the whole, it was so skimpy for the 1951-53 period that it caused a scandal in the American Historical Association, which is the main professional organization of historians. And this uproar forced the State Department to promise that they would soon reissue a new volume for those years that would be more comprehensive. And after many delays, that new volume that was promised in 1989 actually didn't see the light of day until 2017. So what my book is about is, what does this new volume, which is 1,000 pages, over 360 documents, what does it reveal about US policy in Iran? And why was it kept so secret? Why was it considered so sensitive and wasn't released years before? So that was the interrelated question I had about the documents. When it came out, actually, 2017, the American historians tended to dismiss it and say it was actually, it had nothing new. It was basically another facade. And that their complaint was it had nothing new about the coup itself of August 53, which is in a part correct. It had nothing about the coup much to say. But what the American historians missed was that in this period of 51, 53, these documents reveal how much the US was deeply involved in the internal politics of Iran. One usually thinks that the US entered Iranian politics after the coup, but in fact, from 51 on, the US was very deeply involved. And of course, this is a sensitive issue because diplomats and ambassadors and embassies are not supposed to get involved in their host countries and intervene in the host countries. So what the documents really, I think, reveal is how deeply the US was involved. And if you took the couple of documents that had appeared in the earlier FRUS and compare it to the new FRUS, there are even phrases in the old one that were kept censored. So it was kept ... In the new version, where the ... are filled, all it says, in fact, was US was getting involved in internal affairs. So this is a good indication that they were very sensitive about this involvement in internal affairs. Now, on the whole, generally, what involvement was there in Iranian affairs? Well, the new documents confirm what was already known, I think, from the British documents, use of common sense, also memoirs, that the coup of 53 was not really so much about the fear of communism, but the fear that oil nationalization was a contagion that was spread to other countries, including countries where US oil companies had an interest. So this was something that was already known, but I think the new documents really much more confirm this, reinforce this view. And I think many historians who in the past had been arguing that basically the US had acted as an honest broker between Britain and Iran, these documents confirmed that actually US interest was very similar to the British interest, which was not to permit success of the oil nationalization. So in a way, these documents confirmed that something we knew, but some people were reluctant to accept. Another thing the documents confirm, something again other historians have been reluctant to accept, was that really communism was not an issue. It was not a real fear among those who made decisions. It was something that was used often in the press for the common man in the street, that, you know, Reds are going to take over the world, the Russians are out to conquer the world. But the people in the know, especially the CIA who was doing the reporting, they were quite savvy and down to earth that there was really no communist threat in Iran in 1953. Again, one can gather this from previous documents, but these new ones reconfirm that. Now, what do they have new to say in involvement? I think there are actually three major areas you can see US in deep involvement. One is the US strategy of trying to replace Mossadeq with someone else who would be more amiable to accepting a phony type of nationalization, where the US and Britain would accept, in theory, nationalization, but Iran would not actually implement nationalization, and Iran would not control the oil industry. And of course, nationalization in its true sense means that state controls that industry. So the US policy right from the beginning was to try to persuade Mossadeq to accept a sort of hollow form of nationalization. And again, you don't need State Department documents to know this. Someone like Professor Elwell Sutton, who had worked for the British Foreign Office, had worked for the oil company, and had worked for the BBC, he, in his book, actually said that Britain was more than happy to accept nationalization so long as Iran didn't actually enforce it, which means one thing that basically means that this would not be true nationalization. Well, the US policy at the very beginning was try to persuade Mossadeq, nudge him to sort of accept phony nationalization. When they discovered fairly early on and came to the same conclusion as the British, that Mossadeq was not going to move on that issue, then they looked around for a replacement. And this, remember, this is under the Truman administration. It's not under the Eisenhower Republican administration. Early in 1952, the Truman administration was looking for a replacement, not necessarily through a coup, but political maneuvering to replace it. So in May of 52, there was a high-level meeting in Washington, D.C. between the Foreign Office, MI6, State Department, CIA, on who would be a good replacement. And they looked at the CVs of 18 candidates. It was like looking for a candidate for a high position. And they scrutinized 18 candidates, and they came up that the best candidate would be Aravand. Even though Aravand was old, had a corrupt history, and the Shah actually distrusted him. So he was chosen as the best candidate because he was willing to come to an agreement to a meaningless nationalization. So from then on, Henderson, the US ambassador, worked hard to get Aravand as prime minister. He claims that he accidentally bumped into Aravand at a diplomatic reception and then had other meetings with him. And lo and behold, both the British embassy and the US embassy pressured the Shah to get Aravand as prime minister. And this, of course, led to what was known as CAT, the July Uprising, which was a complete failure. Aravand had to resign, and Mossadeq returned as prime minister. So here you have one example of US involvement in naming a prime minister long before the coup. Another area where actually is new, we didn't know, is what is known as Noah Esfand, the 28th of February 53 crisis. And just to remind you about the crisis, what had happened was before that, a few weeks before that, a contingent of Iranian troops in the Bakhtiari area had been ambushed, and some 60 officers and soldiers had been killed. And Mossadeq found evidence linking this uprising not only to the British, but to the court in Tehran. So he confronted the Shah with this information and told him that he would go public with this information. And of course, it would be disastrous for the Shah to have the public know that some people in his entourage had been involved in an uprising that had led to 60 people dying. So the Shah promptly said that he would be willing to leave the country secretly, quietly, on the 28th of February, if the information, Mossadeq did not reveal that information. So everything was set. The Shah had actually packed up his bags. He and Soraya and a few handful of people from the court were due to leave the country. Henderson intervened in this directly with the court, that this would be disaster for Iran and the Shah if the Shah left. And this actually then also created the demonstration of hooligans outside both Mossadeq's home, attack on Mossadeq's home, and a protest around the palace requesting the Shah not to leave. So the upshot of that was that the Shah did not leave on Noah's Fand. And a few weeks later, in fact, we have a report from in the diplomatic papers where Henderson says that the Shah had personally thanked him for having saved the monarchy on the 28th of February. Otherwise, the monarchy would have basically been ended at that time. So here you have a second, you can say, example of direct involvement, decisive involvement. A third area which we didn't know, at least as far as I know, I didn't know, was how far US was involved in Iranian parliamentary politics. Often the politicians, MPs, were considered loose cannons, independent lobbyists, some linked to the Shah, some not, and so on. But what the documents show is both the British embassy and the American embassy directly got involved on who was to run for the Majlis 17th Majlis elections, which was the Majlis under Mossadeq. They were deeply involved in both putting candidates up, putting money, working with journalists to get what they considered suitable deputies in the Majlis. And this Majlis, of course, became a headache for Mossadeq. They couldn't get a majority there to get rid of Mossadeq, but they had enough votes to carry out obstructionism. And the parliamentary rules were that to have a meeting, a quorum, you need a certain number of deputies present. And what the opposition did, and this was opposition, both royalist opposition and pro-American, pro-British opposition, was they just literally left the Majlis building whenever some important bill was to be presented. And government basically came to a standstill. There were some 300 bills, reform bills, ready to be discussed. None could be discussed because no quorum could be established. So again, this was a part of the way of undermining Mossadeq, which the Americans had through the parliamentary process. Incidentally, after the coup, the US also continued this influence in the Majlis. So the next Majlis, the 18th Majlis, which ratified the oil consortium, was again very much monitored and supervised and got involved with by the American embassy to make sure that they got the right candidates in there to vote for the consortium. So these are actually, I would say, very important areas which we didn't know, which US got very much involved, together with, of course, the British. Now, besides this, I think there are other things that the documents actually are quite new or revealing, which is, I would say, the role of the Shah. And nowadays, the Shah is given a bad press. He is seen as sort of a weakling, a Hamlet-like figure who couldn't make up his mind, didn't know what he wanted to do, sort of a minor figure who could be manipulated and so on. Actually, what the documents show is that he is very adamant, very consistent, and much more politically shrewd and savvy than most of his advisors, other politicians, and far, far more savvy than the American and the British embassies. And right from the beginning, actually, Mossadeq was elected in April 1951 prime minister, 51 as prime minister. Right from the beginning, actually, the British and the Americans were asking the Shah to get rid of Mossadeq, dismiss him and appoint someone else. And of course, this was a misunderstanding of the constitution. The Shah didn't have the power to do that. But interestingly enough, the Shah says explicitly, he says, I can't do this. The Mossadeq and oil nationalization really represents the aspirations of Iranian's nation. If I go against Mossadeq and oil nationalization, I will delegitimize my monarchy. I can't do that. And basically, he is opposed to carrying out any type of unconstitutional removal of Mossadeq, especially through a military coup. So he keeps to that position, thick and thin, throughout the years. And it's not till the very end where he's really blackmailed by the US and the UK. He's told, basically, that if they're going to go along with the coup, there's no guarantee that he will still be Shah. One of his brothers might well become the Shah. This was we would have taken this to mean that basically they have another candidate to replace him. So it was that basically that forced his hand and got him eventually to go on board with the coup. But it was not till very late that he was willing to actually sign on, because he knew from the beginning that if he did this, he would be undermining his monarchy. And this, I think, of course, turned out to be foresighted, because this is what exactly happened. After 53, monarchy, however strong it seemed to be militarily, it lacked legitimacy, because people constantly knew that he had been brought to power not just by the foreign powers, but the foreign colonial powers, that, especially Britain, who had ruled Iran in the past, and they had really succeeded in denationalizing and getting control over the oil industry. So what you find is after 53, the Shah is always under the shadow of Mossadeq. People like Alam, even at the height of the oil boom, admit in their diaries that the Shah was obsessed by Mossadeq. And why? Because I think he realized Mossadeq had this national legitimacy, which he did not have. So his strategy was, of course, do somersaults, political somersaults, to get some sort of legitimacy to replace the lost legitimacy of 53. So one way of getting the legitimacy was to become a new revolutionary leader at the head of the White Revolution, a sort of a Bismarckian figure who was going to changing Iran from above and be actually more successful than Mossadeq in carrying out reforms. Another way of somersaulting was to gain legitimacy to see himself as a continuation of 2,000-year monarchy. So you have all the Persepolis parties and stuff about that he was the heir of this long monarchy. This was a way of trying to get legitimacy. Another way, of course, was to act as a grandstand, as a great hawk in the OPEC prices issue. And another, I think, way of getting legitimacy was build up a huge military force to act as Iran as a major national force in the region, and this way appear as a strong nation, again, replacing Mossadeq's nationalism. And all these actually boomeranged, because White Revolution undercut himself, because it removed the class that had in the past been the bulwark of the monarchy, the landed aristocracy, the tribal chiefs. They were still supporter of the Shah at 53, But in 1979, of course, they no longer existed. So they didn't have their peasants or tribesmen to come in to support the regime. The acting as a major force in the Persian Gulf actually reinforced the view in Iran that the Shah was a puppet of the West, because otherwise, why was he acting as the gendarme, American gendarme, in the Persian Gulf? The oil, OPEC actually issue of acting as a hawk was a very short period, actually 3 months. The British ambassadors reported that the Shah was a hawk on the oil prices. And for good reason. The Shah really had very little influence on oil prices, because the oil industry in Iran was really controlled by the consortium, not by him. And it was the oil consortium decided how much oil to produce or not to produce. It was outside the hands of the Shah. So all these somersaulting actually failed to get him legitimacy. So when the crisis occurred, it was minor crisis basically about economic recession, human rights issue. In 1977, 78, the regime had trouble dealing with opposition. As the American ambassadors and the British ambassadors reported, the Shah had trouble finding people in the opposition who considered him legitimate. So there's again a question of legitimacy. Now in writing, of course, pinpoint why the Shah had lost legitimacy, because they would be going back to their own activities of 1953. So they would have a number of reasons why the Shah had lost legitimacy, that he was autocratic, that he didn't trust opposition, that there was corruption in the system, that there was inequality. You could list a host of problems that Iran had, but of course many regimes have similar problems, but they don't collapse. Iran collapsed because the regime had no legitimacy. The only American diplomat who actually was willing, after Albright admitted the US had been involved in the 53 coup, is this American diplomat, Polk, who actually had been involved in 53. And throughout the 50s and 60s had a jaundiced view of the Shah's regime. And he admits basically in his small handbook, it's very not known at all, it's an introduction to Iran. He says basically the regime collapsed in 79 because it didn't have legitimacy, and it had lost its legitimacy in 1953. So to conclude, actually, what the new documents reveal is one thing that, besides the direct US involvement in internal affairs, is also something which we didn't know before, which is the conflict, actually the debates within the Truman administration about policy. And you can see day to day, back and forth, tug of war in the CIA, in the State Department, about policy towards Mossadeq. It's usually argued that it once Eisenhower was elected, then you had new people come in, like Allen, Dulles, and so on, and they carried out the coup. Actually, what is mind-boggling is the people who carried out the coup in August of 53 were actually manning the Iran desk as early as April 51, the same people, Dulles, Roosevelt, Wilbur, Helms, They were the people who were talking about a coup as early as 51, but there was back and forth between them and more, I would say, down-to-earth politicians, and who most of them who were actually academics, people like Joseph Upton, Kyler Young, Langley. They were more sympathetic because they saw Mossadeq and the National Front as the future history, because they represented the modern middle class. So they were much more reluctant to work against Mossadeq. But right from beginning, there was a hardcore of the CIA who thought very much like the British that the only way to deal with Mossadeq was to remove him by hook and by crook, and that their fear, it was not communism, because the CIA reports actually minimized the communist danger. Their fear was they would not express it clearly, but what they, I think, really feared was same as the oil companies, that the contagion of oil nationalization could spread, and this create problems elsewhere. And Henderson, as ambassador, although he represented Truman's administration, his thinking seemed to be very similar to the hardcore CIA. So you get often, you can see it in the documents, tug of war on NIEs and national intelligence estimates, which are often done on this particular country. And it's done with cooperation of the CIA, State Department, military, Pentagon. And there's constant tug of war about the Iran situation. And you constantly get people like Roosevelt drawing the bleakest picture that the communists are about to take over, even though I'm sure he didn't believe that the regime was going to collapse, while you have others actually saying that no, the Mossadeq administration is quite stable, they can control the situation, there is no communist threat, and we should try to negotiate with them. So there is this, you can say, deep state within United States. In actually, when the documents came out, the buzzword in America was, of course, deep state. Trump was talking about the deep state. You do find a deep state in 1951-53 when you're dealing with Iran. You also find there is another thing, which is the term electoral collusion that Trump kicked on using. And ironically, this was exactly what the CIA was doing. There was a great deal of electoral collusion in Iran in manipulating the Majlis election. And finally, third, the notion of fake news that Trump constantly said. What you find in this period is actually quite blatant manufacturing of news information that the CIA knew it was not true, but it circulated in the newspapers and created the atmosphere that basically coup was necessary. To give you one example, they planted articles in Iran claiming that some Soviet defector, KGB defector, had revealed that most of the National Front was really controlled by the two-day, and that clearly the Iranian government was a front for the two-day. But the CIA report itself at that time had a study of 200 important people in Iran, and they said of this 300 people, there are only three people who might be secret communists. And even that is doubtful, because of the three, two actually were permitted into United States and given visas to come to United States. So at the time when communists were not permitted to come to the United States, obviously the State Department itself didn't believe that this was the case. The third person never made it to the United States because he was murdered by goons, probably hired by Barai, who was also actually working with the United States. So what you get is, in fact, a very bleak picture of US involvement. And I think the documents should be read because they are very revealing. And I think the American historians who dismissed it and said, well, there's nothing new because there was nothing new precisely on the coup, are already being misled. They don't understand Iranian history and Iranian politics to basically fully savor what was going on between 51 and 53. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. That was incredibly interesting. Thank you for speaking about your book. And I encourage the audience right now to ask questions that they might have in our Zoom chat or send them to the email media@iran1400.org. And we'll take questions beginning now through our Q&A. You can post your questions in the chat. Before we get into audience questions and while we allow them to post their questions in the chat, I have a few of my own that I wanted to ask, one in particular because he happens to be here today. So first, let me say, after I finished your book, I went through, because the Iran 1400 project aspires to create a dialogue. So because of that, after I finished reading your book, I went through and looked at our past events and our past articles and looked to find what had been written about the topics that your book touched. And coincidentally, in our past spotlighting an author event with John Qazvinian, he touched on a few things that your book mentioned. He happens to be here in the audience with us today, so I thought that that would be a good question to begin our Q&A section with. So during a past spotlighting an author event, historian John Qazvinian states that there is a highly ahistorical and ideological attempt by some people to rewrite history and play down the US role in the coup. Your book also touched on this sort of revisionist history very well. What direction do you think we are heading in regarding this revisionist history? Do you think that those downplaying the role of the coup or the US role of the coup are simply outliers, or do you think there is a chance that if we aren't careful, that this could become more mainstream? Follow-up that I'll include now. Qazvinian also calls this revisionist scholarship recent. Do you agree that this is new? If so, why is it starting to gain more traction now rather than decades ago?
Well, I actually haven't had a chance to read John's book, but I would agree that there is a tendency to say the US role has been exaggerated. The thing is, if you set up a straw man, then it's easy to knock it down. If you claim that the coup was done purely by the Americans or the British and Iranians played no role, then obviously US role is exaggerated. US could not have carried out a coup without some Iranian participation. The question is balancing what is the definitive role. Could there have been a coup without the US and the UK? And the answer clearly is there couldn't have been. First of all, there were army officers who were royalists who did participate in the coup. So one can't deny the role of the tank officers who carried out the coup. But those tank officers actually needed coordination. They needed urging. There was no one to actually lead them. Zahedi was later presented as the coup leader, but you find in the documents that Zahedi actually had very little following in the commissioned officers. He was used by the coup as a figurehead rather than actually organizer. Most of the Zahedi's supporters were retired officers drinking Johnny Walkers in the retired officer club. They were not people who would actually be in charge of tanks to come in. So there was really, without that American involvement, there was not the coordination. The only officer that could have, you can say, played an important role from the Iranian side is Colonel Akhavi, who actually gave the Shah a name of 40 officers who he told the Shah they were willing to participate. Again, the Shah was very reluctant to go along with the coup unless actually someone came with names, and he didn't trust Zahedi because he knew Zahedi was a bluffer. Zahedi could, talk big about it. He had a whole army, he had the whole country behind him, and the Shah was too smart to buy that. But Akhavi actually presented the Shah with 40 officers who were willing to participate. But again, Akhavi's role is pretty minor, because after the failure of the first coup, he literally had a nervous breakdown. He was ready to blow his brain out. And it was the chief of staff, who was an old childhood friend, who persuaded him to go to a sanatorium. And so on the actual coup, he was out of the scene. So the role of the army officers is important, but the coordination and the leadership had to come actually from the CIA. The other argument that is given, that is the clergy that did the coup. Again, the money that went to organize the thugs in Tehran, what was called Behbahani money, we know again from the documents that it was actually CIA money. So again, without the CIA that would not have worked out. So I think one could put up a straw argument, say, well, the Iranians played no role at all, and then argue then the US role is being exaggerated. But on the other hand, if you look at it in the question of who plays the decisive roles, then it's the CIA, I would say. And the only people who would have actually grievances against this are MI6, because MI6 people felt that they actually played a role, and people like Roosevelt and Wilbur had underplayed their role. So later on, someone like Derbyshire, who was the MI6 man in Tehran, he was pissed off, a bit like Wilbur, and he spilled the beans about that the CIA, that the MI6 actually had played also a very important role.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And we're going to ask one more question related to our past Iran 1400 content, and then we'll start asking the audience the questions from the audience. So in another article on our website entitled U.S. Diplomacy in Defense of Iran's Independence and Territorial Integrity During the Anglo-Soviet Occupation of Iran in 1941, Ali Sajjadi carefully examined scores of telegrams between Great Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, along with the governments of Turkey and Iran, in the last 6 months of 1941. Based on his research, Sajjadi argues that during the Anglo-Soviet occupation in 1941, the US exerted considerable influence to protect Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity from Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Do you believe this to be an accurate statement? And if so, what occurred that caused such a significant change in the United States' motives towards Iran between 1941 and 1953?
Well, I haven't actually examined carefully enough of that earlier period, but I would be skeptical about the Cold War interpretations. I would want to go relook at the stuff, hopefully Soviet archives too. But one thing I'm suspicious of in the Cold War notion is somehow the Soviets initiated the Cold War in Iran by insisting on an oil concession in Azerbaijan and then trying to create a separatist movement in Azerbaijan. There, I think the story is much more complicated. The Soviets were really uninterested in Azerbaijan until they discovered that the Iranian government was secretly negotiating with an American oil company to give an oil concession to America on their border in Azerbaijan. And that there had been an oil concession to a Russian before 1917. And the Russians, the Soviet Russia had actually canceled that concession on the understanding that it wouldn't be given to another foreign power. So they suddenly discovered during World War II, this is at a time when the Soviets had lost 20 million people fighting the Nazis, that America, its own close ally, was shopping around to get an oil concession a stone throw away from Baku in Azerbaijan. So once that rumor actually spread in the Majlis, once they got wind of that concession, the negotiations, then they demanded that there should be an oil concession to the Soviet Union in Azerbaijan. So the Cold War, I think, was initiated not so much by the Soviets, but by American oil companies. And it's always a wonder to me why the State Department permitted the oil companies to actually become so controversial and so aggressive at the height of World War II. And there is a telegram from Moscow, from the embassy there, criticizing the oil companies for trying to get this oil concession. So it must have been controversial within the State Department itself. But this started a rolling, because once that crisis started, then one way of ensuring that the Russians got some concession was to have some sort of autonomy in Azerbaijan, not necessarily independence, but autonomy from the central government. And that, of course, then created the notion that America was for integrity and unity of Iran, and the Soviets were for the disintegration of Iran, which in some ways is true, but you have to also take into consideration that what initiated the whole crisis was the American shopping for an oil concession right on their footsteps.
Fantastic. Thank you. So before we go on to the next question, I wanted to let everyone know that we are definitely going to be going over time. And so if y'all have somewhere that y'all need to be, please know that this is going to be recorded and you can watch this on YouTube later on. And with that said, we're happy to have you here as long as you can stay, Dr. Abrahamian. So I'd love to ask you some more of the audience's questions, but do let us know if you have somewhere else that you need to be.
No, I'm fine. I'm free.
Fantastic. Great. Then we are very excited to get into now the audience part of the Q&A. So beginning with the question, Professor Abrahamian, how concerned was the US with the two-day party prior to the 1953 coup? And to what extent did this concern influence decisions to stage a coup against Mossadeq?
Well, publicly, the US claimed that their main concern, their only concern, was the communism, the two-day. And Roosevelt says, of course, the British were interested about oil, but we Americans were not interested about oil. We were just concerned about communism and world domination and so on. So that is something that was said so much that the press, in fact, also repeated it, and it's still repeated nowadays. People who say, well, the coup was a mistake, go back to Obama's speech about 53, that it was regrettable, but you have to remember, he said, you have to put it in context. The context, of course, being in Cold War, and in Cold War, therefore, unfortunate, unpleasant things had to happen. I think what the documents actually show is, so of course, there was a Cold War, there was the Korean War. This was not imagined. But as far as Iran was concerned, when you look at the nitty-gritty of Iran, the British, the American CIA, I'm not just talking about the State Department or the academics, the CIA documents who monitored the two-day were all basically confident there was really no two-day threat. And you get actually a CIA report written 2 days before the coup, saying that the two-day is not in a position for carry out a coup. They're not talking about a coup. They don't have militia. They don't have arms. They're actually telling their fellows to read Lenin's infantile leftism. So a communist party about to take over is not going to tell its members to read Lenin's infantile leftism, I assure you. So there was really, and one document says the only chance the two-day have of coming to power is through the parliamentary means. And the similar document from the CIA says, well, the two-day had 2.3% of the electorate. So you do your calculation. If you have 2.3% of the electorate, how many centuries is it going to take you to get into parliamentary majority? So you also get the British, who had monitored Iran very closely since 1941. They always argued that there was really no communist threat. And one reason they were so confident, and they told the Americans, is that they actually monitored the military very carefully. So the only possibility of a two-day overtake was through the military rather than a revolution. But again, the British were confident this was not possible because from 1941, they had made sure, working with the G2, which was the army intelligence in Iran, to make sure that leftist officers were not in a position to carry out a coup. They were sidelined often to positions that were harmless, send them off to Baluchistan or Sistan, or put them in military academies to teach cadets, or put them in the medical corps, not make sure that none of them, these officers, left-wing officers, would be tank commanders. And therefore in a position to carry out a coup, because in the 50s, to carry out a coup, you needed tank officers. So they were quite sure that two-day had been marginalized in the military. So they had no fear about a possibility of a two-day coup. Later on, actually, after the coup, when the two-day officer network was revealed and 600 officers turned out to be members of the two-day underground, this gave fuel to the idea that the two-day was about to take over. Again, it looks very impressive, 600 officers. And some people nowadays even argue that if the Tudeh had the will, they could have taken over in 53 because they had 600 officers. But if you look at these 600 officers, first of all, the numbers are not that impressive. The army, Iranian army was top heavy. There were over 60,000 army officers. So 600 among 60,000 is a drop. Similarly, if you look at who these 600 were, most of them were not commissioned officers in the tank brigades. They were in peripheral positions that where they could not have carried out a coup. So it's often the image, the idea that there were so many secret members, and therefore they could have carried out a coup. But people like Roosevelt, the MI6, who had information about such things, they knew that there was no possibility of a coup. So what was often used, again, in terms of creating an impression and propaganda was that Iran could become another Czechoslovakia. Remember, Czechoslovakia recently had a coup, and the communists had taken over Czechoslovakia. And constantly this theme was used that Iran was going on the same road of Czechoslovakia. Articles were planted in Iranian papers about Czechoslovakia. Politicians in the Majlis, who were probably linked to the CIA, constantly referred to the Czechoslovakia. And even nowadays, you find people who write about the coup, they talk about the fear of Czechoslovakia. But there are no two countries more different than Iran and Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a highly industrial society. The communists and their allies had more than 50% of the electorate. They controlled the main ministries before the coup. They controlled the Ministry of Interior, the Defense, Intelligence. All the army officers in the Czech army had been trained by the Soviets. When you come to Iran, it's a very different situation where most of the army officers, especially tank officers, were trained by the US. It was highly agrarian society. The Communist Party, sure, it could organize demonstrations or strikes in major cities, but it really was in no position to carry out a military revolution or coup. And also, what also this picture neglects is that in Czechoslovakia, there were no tribes, obviously. In Iran, you look at the tribal structure, the US had a huge foothold among the Qashqai's. In fact, its base was in the Qashqai's. They had armed Qashqai's. The Qashqai's themselves had offered to carry out a coup on behalf of the CIA. This was independent of the military coup. The British had armed and paid the Bakhtiaris, the Boer Ahmadis, the Arab tribes in the south. So these major tribes, each of them had at least 10,000, 20,000 armed men, were already mobilized for the British and the Americans. And there was no counter prevailing force. The one CIA document says that one place the Soviets could have basically found an audience among the tribes were among the Kurds, but the Soviets showed no interest in the Kurds, and they were actually bewildered by the Soviets had no interest in arming the Kurds in 53. So when you look at, generally you can say, Cold War, there's a fear of communism and so on, there's a danger here and there's Czechoslovakia, Korea. But when you actually get to look at Iran itself and how the CIA looked at Iran, there was really no real threat of communism there. So for me, it was a good, basically, cover to basically hide the real reason for the coup, which was the fear of oil nationalization.
Thank you so much. Let's head on to our next question. Can you please briefly discuss the assassination of Prime Minister Ali Razmara, who, I believe, opposed the Majlis and Mossadeq in 1951? Was his assassination by the Fedayeen Islam because of his opposition to oil nationalization activities in Majlis, or something else? As a follow-up question, what was the role of Islamic elements in that period?
Yeah, clearly the assassination of Razmara was done by the Fedayeen Islam. There's no secret about that. The question was that Kashani also encouraged the Fedayeen Islam to do it or not. I suspect he did. Interesting enough, one of the CIA documents to sort of undermine the Tudeh was to spread out false information that the Tudeh was actually involved in Razmara's assassination. So this was part of what was known as gray propaganda. But there is no doubt that the assassin was from the Fedayeen Islam. Yeah. And at that time, the Fedayeen Islam, and if someone basically is categorize someone as pro-British or a British agent. And this was Razmara's basically smear. He was an obvious target then.
Thank you. The next question, is there anything in these new documents about the relationship between the US and Islamist figures like Ayatollah Kashani, Nawab Safavi, etc.? Also, do you believe that the dissolving of the parliament gave the power, according to the constitution, to the Shah to replace Mossadeq, or did the Shah not have this right at all?
All right, take the second part. Actually, Iran was either blessed or cursed with two constitutions. One is the fundamental laws of 1906. One is what the practice of Reza Shah, which was basically autocracy, and the Majlis was a rubber stamp that did whatever he wanted. According to the constitution, basically the Majlis elected the prime minister, okay? And the prime minister remained prime minister until the Majlis voted him out or voted a new prime minister. And in recent times, that was the practice. For instance, Aravand, during the oil crisis and the Soviet crisis of 1956-57, the 14th Majlis had elected him prime minister. The 14th Majlis then had closed, and there was not to be any 15th Majlis elections until the Soviet troops left. So Aravand was confident, and people accepted that as long as there was no 15th Majlis elections, Aravand was prime minister. And he remained prime minister until actually the 15th Majlis convened, and the Shah was able to mobilize enough members in the 15th Majlis to depose him. So I think the recent procedure accepted was that once the Majlis had elected Mossadeq prime minister, he would remain as prime minister. And when the Majlis was dissolved, actually Mossadeq made the precaution to issue election orders for the next Majlis, 18th Majlis, so that the gap would be short, and then the 18th Majlis could either re-elect him or elect a new Majlis. So the idea that the Shah could actually appoint a prime minister was a bit stretching the argument.
Thank you, Dr. Abrahamian. Our next question, was Eisenhower more inclined to go along with the Brits than Truman? Were the Brits more successful in convincing Eisenhower?
Eisenhower actually makes some sort of revealing remarks in the cabinet, and he stresses constantly the sanctity of private property, the sanctity of international contracts. And he's arguing that Iran has really violated the sanctity of international agreements by nationalizing the oil industry. So it's very much, I would say, part of the protection of the capitalist system, that if countries like Iran get away with expropriating, what he would call expropriating foreign companies, then there was the end of the world civilization as we know it. There would be chaos and capitalism would be threatened. And he's quite explicit about that. In fact, much more explicit than talking about the dangers of communism. In public, yes, but in private, it's always the concern about sanctity of contracts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Our next question is, could we group nationalization of natural resources of Middle Eastern countries as the victim of the same American foreign policy short-sightedness? Case in point, Egypt and Iraq.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is the US was not in favor of nationalization at the time of Mossadeq. Later on, by the 70s, many countries had quietly actually taken over the oil industry. Even Aramco had been taken over by the Saudis. Iraq had taken over oil industry, Kuwait, and so on. So by then, the US basically accepted oil nationalization, which it wasn't willing to accept in 51, 53. And partly for the reason for that was the oil companies themselves had come to the conclusion that it was simpler to have local oil companies run the industry. You didn't have to worry about strikes and so on. It was a more efficient way. Anyway, the main profits were at the down flow, at the selling of the oil. And there the oil companies were making good profits selling the oil to the consumer. So it wasn't a problem for them, and it wasn't a problem for the United States to have nationalization in the 70s.
Thank you. Our next question, could you touch on the following two issues? The deteriorated relations between Ford and the Shah after the oil price rise on the destiny of the regime, and the U.S. and Iran revolution, or U.S. and Iran relations after the 1979 revolution.
Well, I think the usual impression is that the Shah antagonized the United States because he was calling for higher oil prices, that he was a hawk on oil prices. And then the royalists then argued the reason America then was pissed off at the Shah and even engineered the revolution was to basically teach the Shah a lesson because he had been a hawk on the oil prices. But as I said earlier, the British embassy actually, Parsons, the ambassador, reported that the Shah was a hawk on oil prices for about 3 months. That was a brief period. And the Shah actually realized, realistically enough, that he was in no position to control oil prices. What he could do is go to OPEC and tell OPEC countries, you should cut your oil production, because the only way you can increase oil prices is to cut production. You can't just, post the price and say, this is going to be the price. You have to have the backing that you're going to cut the prices, production, so there is shortage, then the prices would go up. But so he was encouraging Arab countries to cut production in order to increase prices. But he couldn't do that in Iran because production in Iran was not under his control. It was under consortium's control. So he, again, did sort of jigsaw somersaults. He offered to sell oil to Britain and the United States on barter agreements for weapons and airplanes and submarines. With barter agreements, then, of course, you don't really know what the real price is because you could hide it away. So there's a lot of phoniness about the conflict between the Shah and the Ford administration. It really was not a real issue about, I would say, geopolitics. So it wasn't something that people like Kissinger really took seriously, that the Shah was a threat to them. In fact, the book by Cooper is a very revealing statement. Cooper quotes Kissinger saying that actually we never took the Shah that seriously anyway.
Thank you. Our next question is, what made Britain think that oil nationalization will be only on paper and not in reality?
Well, they thought that they could persuade Iran just to have a facade that they had nationalized oil, but that Britain or a consortium would actually continue the production, in charge of production. And this is, of course, it wasn't completely imaginary. This is exactly what they got with the consortium. They succeeded, where basically they didn't get fully what they wanted, was the AIOC coming back fully uncontrolled. They had to share it with the consortium. But again, here, even there's a complication. The devil is in the detail. If you look at the consortium agreement, BP, which was new name for AIOC, plus Shell, which is a misnomer, Shell Dutch, was really a British company. It was a twin brother or sister of BP. They had 51% of consortium. So Britain actually did retain control over Iranian oil after 54.
Thank you. So another question. You are arguing that anti-communism was not an important factor propelling the CIA to take its position on the coup. But couldn't oil nationalization or nationalization in general itself be seen as a first step toward communist takeover with or without active participation of the Soviet Union in the eyes of the Cold Warriors? My question is whether anti-communism could be conceptualized in a broader sense.
Well, the people in the CIA, both Truman and Eisenhower administration, knew that someone like Mossadeq was not a communist. He wasn't nationalizing the oil industry as a communist project. He was nationalizing it as a way of national sovereignty, independence. You can't really argue that nationalization would inevitably lead to communism. And history showed that later on, of course. In the 70s, oil was nationalized and other things were nationalized, like the Suez Canal. This didn't lead to communism. In fact, it was a good bulwark against communism. So you could argue it in 51 that the way of actually creating roadblocks to communism in Iran was to support nationalists. And people actually, I think people like Cotter would have argued along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And so it looks like we have time for one more question. And the question is, this is in knowing that you've done so much research on the events leading to 1953, as well as the events of 1953, what surprised you? Was there anything that surprised you? Anything new that's really surprised you while you were researching specifically for the book that we talked about today?
Well, generally, I mean, what was surprised is how much US was involved in nitty-gritty of internal politics. This was, often seen that the British had sort of behind every plot and every conspiracy, that the Americans were sort of more distant and not knowing what they were doing. I think what these documents really show, or for me was glaring and surprising, is how much they were involved in day-to-day politics, even, who gets elected to the match less. You can't get on a more micro level than that.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Great. Thank you so much. That concludes our Q&A section. Thank you again for joining us today at Spotlighting an Author. And please, I encourage the audience, if y'all like what you heard today, please go out and buy Dr. Abrahamian's amazing book that's incredibly interesting. It's called Oil Crisis in Iran, From Nationalism to Coup D'Etat. And also, if you enjoyed what you heard today, please sign up for our newsletter and you'll be notified about our next Spotlighting an Author event with Fatemeh Shams, where she will discuss a revolution in rhyme, poetic co-option under the Islamic Republic, which comes out. So this event will be on Friday, August 6th, and an invitation email will be sent out soon. And again, if y'all like what you heard, please check out our resources. We have 2 articles, one upcoming, that touch on US-Iran relations. Ali Sajadi's US efforts to consolidate Iran's independence and territorial integrity during World War II is already available in Farsi and will come out in English soon. And we also have an article, The Quest for Power and Respect, a survey of Iranian foreign policy since 1921. And our 2 previous Spotlighting an Author events also touch on US-Iran relations, one with John Ghazvinian and one with Kyle Olson. As well, we do have a podcast, and you can subscribe to that where you listen to your podcasts. And lastly, if you are interested at all in getting involved, please send an email to us at iran1400.org and let us know what you thought of today's event. Let us know if there's anyone you'd like to see in future events, and if you'd like to get involved, please just email us and we're happy to chat with y'all. Thanks again, everyone, for coming and listening to our Spotlighting an Author event. And thank you especially one more time to Ervand Abrahamian for his incredibly interesting presentation and Q&A section today about his new book, one more time, that is called Oil Crisis in Iran, From Nationalism to Coup D'Etat. Thank you again, Ervand Abrahamian.
Thank you, Sidney, for inviting me. Thank you.